And we're live. Hello, this is Open Studio with Kim Jorgensen Gane. This is, I forget what episode of Triggered by Trumpism, my series wherein I ask the question, what have you started that's badass? And I'm going to bring in my guest today, Ali Khaleel from Men4Choice and other wonderful things. We are continuing a conversation we started last week that is about healthy masculinity. So I'm going to bring Ali in, and I didn't get myself any water. I'm going to be sorry. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How are you today?
I'm doing well. I'm moving in the next few days, so that's going to be interesting. But
wow. Well, I'm very grateful that you took time out to do this with me again 2 weeks ago.
Of course. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Likewise. Well, it's a really important conversation that we started last week, and particularly it's so suited, I think, to my topic, triggered by Trumpism, because it is very clearly, if we know, for some people, obviously the Trump presidency is affirming them. And it is making them feel like men's men. It is making them, and these are some people I'm related to.
Yeah.
And in just people in my community, I have noticed, people driving around in pickup trucks with American flags or Confederate flags flying. And one of the things, so you had invited me to read the article in the Atlantic by Peggy Orenstein, The Miseducation of the American Boy, which, wow, that was, something that, of course, it's why I'm writing my book, really, because I've mothered girls, a generation of girls. My girls are in their 30s. And I'm mothering a generation of boys. I have two 17-year-old boys in my house, my son and my nephew, that we have guardianship of. So obviously, recognizing that everything in that article, is true, is why I'm writing my book, Mother Feminists, Raising Ourselves and the Men We Fall For. And this presidency has really doubled down on unhealthy masculinity. And what I really want to tie it to is how racism is included in that.
Sure.
And we talked last week about the protests that we've seen across the country, particularly in Michigan, with a woman governor that we have. Guys draped with AR-15s and not wearing their masks, and what the racial makeup is of the majority of those people and the gender makeup of the majority of those people. Most of them are men, and they're all white. So,
yeah, I think it's certainly it's interesting and needed to talk about the intersection of masculinity and white supremacy. Those are like men's rights activists and white supremacists are just one big concentric circle.
Yes.
That's not, there is no Venn diagram. It's just one big circle.
It is.
And it's interesting doing that work looking like I do in Wisconsin. And I think it has to do, when I do the work, it has a lot to do with lack of exposure. A lot of the young white 17, 18-year-olds that I interact with in Wisconsin have never met an Indian person, have never met someone from a Muslim family. So I think one, it's an issue of exposure. And I think that President Trump has made it easier to think that exposure isn't necessary.
Right.
But you don't need to expand your worldview.
Right.
Your worldview is exactly as big as it needs to be. as
Yeah.
narrow as it might be.
Yeah, like we are enough.
Yeah.
You know, being the supreme race,
Yep.
and being, you know, just we're enough with just each other. We don't need anybody else.
Yeah.
We can conquer our women, and we can conquer the rest of the world, and we can be in charge. And
yeah.
Yeah.
I think that, and you know, I was just sort of, you know, finishing high school when President Obama was elected, but I feel like that election, kind of looking back on it, as in there have been many pieces written about this now, but that presidency, I felt like, was prompting us to evolve in a way that was uncomfortable for many, but really welcome by a lot of other people. Like, this is a sign that we're moving forward, and that people who were not part of the conversation were not going to be included in the conversation. And President Trump, in a lot of ways, represents people saying, no, we're going to close that door again.
Exactly.
We don't want to invite you.
White lash.
Exactly.
It's white lash. And, you know, what I have said, and what I believe to my dying day, is that what Barack Obama did was that he ruined every stereotype that, you know, particularly from Reagan on, about they're all thugs, drug dealers, you know, and women are all welfare queens. And we're talking about Black men and Black women. So when Barack Obama's beautiful, classy, completely free of scandal family got such a platform, the response, you know, that pendulum has gone completely off the rails.
Yep.
And the response was Trump was elected. And this is why I'm doing this, is because I want people to I don't want people to get apathetic. And it's so, when you are triggered every day, and that's, you know, that's the second meaning in my title, right, of this series. When you spend every single day, I can't look at the president, I can't listen to his voice. And part of that is as a sexual assault survivor. But the other part of it is just the hate. I just can't take it in. And so every single day of this presidency, I have felt triggered and wounded. And I know that a lot of people are feeling that way, and we can't get apathetic. And, you know, it's like we have to outlast, you know, I don't know. It's like Survivor. We're on freaking, you know, game of Survivor, and we just have to believe that that was true, that Barack Obama and his family, that was a true thing. We really made that happen. And it wasn't, you know, when we look at the election results when Trump was elected, and how suburban white women, particularly, as you know, I can wear that mantle for at least a portion of my life. I was a suburban white woman. I'm inner city now, but it's a really small city, so I don't think it counts as you know, it's mortifying to know who voted for that.
Yep.
But where the failure was, not failure, it was the people who didn't vote at all.
Right.
That is what got Trump elected. So in relation to the article that we read, you know, part of me was like, oh my God, have I done everything wrong? Like, have I made life harder for my boys because I hope, taught them to be well-rounded individuals. I've taught them to be kind, I hope. I've taught them to be good men, I hope. What is that going to mean for them? You know, neither of my boys are big-time athletes. Right. My nephew played baseball, but not in high school, so not in the locker room, you know, situation so much. You drop your kids off, they play, you leave. You know, it wasn't. So there weren't those opportunities, I don't think, so much for unhealthy masculinity, but I think he probably has observed plenty of it. I know that my son has observed plenty of it. And I feel like they feel like they're on the outside, you know, the young men that she interviewed.
Yeah. So this is something that I really struggle with, that dynamic, even when it comes to in my classes in education, where we talk about, really radically, like teaching our students in is still unfortunately is considered a radical way of thinking about how they should feel empowered
Yeah.
to be agents of change in their communities. Um, but that's sort of that doesn't take into account the institutions that they're stepping into when they leave our classroom, or in this case, our homes,
Right.
into institutions that don't care about what we're teaching them. They don't care about that somebody wants to be an agent of change, that they have these sort of rules and guidelines that have been ingrained for years to sort of preserve the power of the dominant group.
Mm-hmm.
And so are we doing our students a disservice, our children a disservice, when we're not teaching them how to play the game, so to speak?
Right.
How to speak that language. We're telling them this is what's right and hold on to what's right. But in this case, the very beginning of this chapter talks about how the young man Cole sort of takes a step back and lets his friend speak up because he sees that he's not playing the game and he's losing. So I'm going to step back and let him say the unpopular thing, and I'm just going to sort of go with the flow, even though in the back of my mind I know that's not what's right. I'm playing the game that will allow me to stay inside of this group, inside of the circle.
And that kid, the young man Cole, his ability to verbalize, what he was experiencing, talking about his friend's social currency and how he had spent all of it, and how Cole himself wasn't willing to spend all of his social currency, and how they were both younger guys, they were both sophomores, and the team then, their response was they didn't listen to his friend anymore. They didn't, care what he had to say anymore. They just kind of, I don't know, ignored him, after that, because he had spent all of his social currency defending, what was right versus playing along.
Yeah. It's a struggle. I think it's important to teach our, young people, our children, our students, what is right, while also providing them that context that not everyone believes what I'm teaching you. Not everyone, you're not going to, and this pains me to say it, but being right doesn't pay off always, especially when you're young. And being right is not a priority of most people, of a lot of people. It's about being accepted, which is incredibly important. And it's only complicated when, Cole was a white student, but when you are a student of color and trying to be accepted, that's already an uphill battle. And so you're trying to minimize any other differences that you do have, because the most visible difference you can't really help. So you're doing everything else you can to be accepted. And often that means sort of shutting up that voice inside your head that sometimes is the voice of a parent or another mentor that's saying, that's not right. You just want to be accepted.
And how, and when society rewards that acceptance, but, if you're one of the dudes, one of the bros, in the article, you're going to get the interview, you're going to get the job, you're going to have the connections. And when there is such a price attached to that and a reward, either you get the reward or you don't. I forgot to get myself water. I'm going to do, that's unfortunate. What I think was really explained well in this article was what she really didn't talk about was the racism aspect of it. It was really directed at sexism. But I think I said this last week. I had attended a Brave Talk training, and the quote that I took out of it from the YWCA facilitator was, "We cannot hope to achieve gender equity without first healing racism." So that's really, obviously in reproductive justice work, I know that that's critical. But what I've come to understand is the connection between reproductive justice is economic justice, is racial justice. I don't know what my question is, other than, how, I mean, it's not like if we elect someone other than Trump, 4 more years of Trump, first of all, is going to be devastating. It has already been devastating to me personally, and to, economically, obviously, his lack of response to the, pandemic, to the global pandemic. This is not just happening here. It is happening all over the world. The economy, we live in a global economy. The economy is, being brutally harmed all across the world. And the people who are hurting the most are the people who were already falling through the cracks. We talked about that. And all the social programs, that these are the first things that everybody wants to cut.
It's simple, right? It's always easy to push people off the margins. And it's always going to be people of color, people who have been already marginalized by the current institutions. It's just going to contract the group of people that those institutions benefit.
Yeah.
And so it's just going to increase the people that are on the margins.
Yeah.
The more non-dominant identities you have, it's just going to become more and more likely that you're going to fall off the side in terms of being served. Yeah. And it's easy because those are still the people that are furthest away from the purview of those in power. And, when we think about reproductive justice, you probably know the statistics better than I do, but in terms of access to reproductive health care, it's just astronomical in areas that are of lower socioeconomic status, of higher populations of people of color, especially in the South. People are driving, hundreds of miles to access reproductive care.
Right. And having to miss work, when, states that enact waiting periods, 24-hour, 48-hour, 72-hour, even in some places, waiting periods. And for someone who has to drive several hours, to a different state to access the reproductive health care and find child care for their kids, because something we rarely talk about, 59% of the people who access abortion care are already parents. These aren't people who don't know what it is to be a parent. They're people who are the economic issue, people who are considering whether or not they can feed the children they already have, whether or not their resources can be stretched, with one more mouth to feed. It is really devastating. It's devastating that so many states have used the pandemic to further limit access to reproductive health care. It really starts to feel very pointed and very on purpose, to further squeeze out and further strangle, further dominate. It's about ensuring that, white people stay the dominant race.
White men specifically.
Yeah. And that, that ties it right back to those protests, that we're seeing around the country. And the complicity, I think, of white women, white women are the gatekeepers so many times. White women so many times, we're the secretaries, we're the teachers, if you look back at the kind of Mad Men, mentality, I mean, secretaries really were the gatekeepers. We were called secretaries. But, that still happens. And what we can see, so many of the white women who are the angriest at, and it's kind of like, well, I can conform. Why can't you? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's so, we're conditioned, we're conditioned to believe that, we're conditioned to think that we are worth less, that we don't deserve as much, that in order to be accepted, we have to conform.
Yeah.
And if we are not accepted, it's our fault. That it is a deficiency of character, and that it is our responsibility to conform, to not rock the boat. And I think there's also, real implications to that, because I know that for my mom, it was a survival. It was an issue of survival to conform or not to conform. If
Right.
she didn't listen to the men in her life when she was younger who were trying to make decisions for her, she would lose any sense of safety
Right.
that she had because it was still those men who were controlling the degree to which she felt safe in her own home, in her own, financial security, whatever she had at the time. And so I think it's also an issue of just of survival,
Yeah.
as sadly as it is. But I think reproductive health care is part and parcel to that. It takes away another lever by which you can take control of your own life,
Right.
which just makes you more susceptible to the power of others when you have less and less control over your own body.
Yeah.
I know that if my mom had more power over her own life when she was younger, there might have been decisions that she would have made differently.
Right. Well, and right there, that's the key.
Yeah.
I think that there is, what we started to touch on last week was fear.
Mm.
The theme in that we had started to talk about the protests across the country, the armed protests across the country, and recognizing that they are afraid. Privilege, I think privilege is something that we have to talk about, because privilege doesn't mean that people don't suffer. Privilege doesn't mean, that life isn't hard.
Right.
My parents have had 6 marriages between them. My mother absolutely hates it when I say that, but it's sorry. It's not like growing up was super easy. It's not like I was a single mom for 6 years. Raised my daughter alone, no child support. Okay, but I had white skin and I had an excellent public school education. So I still had privilege. I benefited from racism, first of all. And I took a 2.5-day understanding systemic racism workshop.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to say, I don't experience racism. And the facilitator, it was like a record screech, stopped everything. And she was like, hold the phone. You do experience racism. You benefit from it. And, and I, I'm holding back tears, trying not to. And she pretty much hammered me for 10 minutes about how, I do experience racism, that I benefit from it, that, so our complicity in the patriarchy, as white women, that is what you're saying, about your mom making different choices. That's exactly it. So the unhealthy masculinity, it's kill or be killed, basically.
Yeah.
And it is conquer and have dominion over, manifest destiny. White man shall have dominion over the earth. I lost my train of thought a little bit.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I think this understanding of how we benefit from the systems is something that I think men need to recognize, specifically men of color. I think that when I have these conversations with men of color, which is actually a minority of the discussions that I have these discussions mostly with white men who are in some ways more open to talking about it because a lot of them are, high school and college age. And while they often come from rural parts of Wisconsin, they are, as was the case in the article from Peggy Orenstein, they understand how to talk about it. Mm-hmm. They know what they're supposed to think. Even if they don't live those values, they know that they are in vogue now. And to say something to the contrary is going to be risky. Doesn't mean they don't say it, but it's risky. because they know what's going on with the Me Too movement. They know what's happening, even if it hasn't touched them, in their small communities.
Mhm.
They're online. They know what's going. They know the conversations that are happening online. So thankfully, they're a little bit more careful with what they say. Now, that being said, I'm also the person leading the conversation, so
Sure.
I also have to keep in mind that they might say things differently if I had white skin and they
Right.
felt more free to say certain things. But I think with the men of color that I've had this conversation with, it's really important for us, while being people of color, to also recognize the male privilege that we still hold in spaces. There's this exercise that we did when I was training to be a sexual assault advocate in Minnesota, where we kind of did an identity inventory.
Mm.
And we wrote down, what identity do we have based on all of these different demographics? And one of the follow-up questions was, which identity do you think about the least? And it's always the identities that you give you the most power that you
Yeah.
think about the least.
Yeah.
And so for me, I was one of 3 men in the entire training, and we were the three people who went to the side of the room when they asked, which identity do you think about the least? And we were the 3 that went to gender. uh, because we don't think about it. I haven't had to think about that gender very often, or
Right.
that identity very often, because
Whereas for women, we are, believe it was Shirley Chisholm who said that she had been discriminated against more as a woman than as a Black woman. So for us, that's the first mantle we wear.
Yeah, because it's the identity that marginalizes you
Yeah.
in the most often. But I think that it's important for all of us to recognize the privilege that we do have, um, and how that has granted us access and acceptance
Mm-hmm.
into certain spaces while still being able to be true to ourselves. Because I think that, I've gained access into circles in communities where like I didn't fit in, but it was because I had to go through certain hoops to
Mm-hmm.
gain that acceptance. But my identity as a man was one identity that was never questioned.
Yeah.
And it's important to recognize that and see how that, you know, allows us to navigate spaces a little bit easier than folks who don't have those identities.
Right. Well, and there are certain assumptions, that are made. Um, I think that men are assumed smart for the most part.
Yep.
I think that, women are not, and it's not to say I recognize that women of color, that certainly Indigenous women, Latinx women, Black women, I understand that they have to work, 1,000 times harder than I even have to work.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have pay parity. And it's worse, for Indigenous women. I think it's the worst for Indigenous women, if I remember correctly. Yeah. It's worse for Latinx women. It's worse for Black women, women in general compared to men. It's worse for white women than it is for men. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I have no idea. I don't even know that the conversation really is out there as to whether or not there is pay equity among men of different races.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that. Certainly. And it's something that I struggle with sometimes when I'm applying for a new job. Not necessarily in terms of pay, but in terms of the preconceived notions that people have about me, not only as a man in education, because the majority of P12 educators are women.
Sure.
It's a little bit more equal in higher ed, where I moved into just a year ago, but all of my previous experience was in P12. And I struggle with how much of the decision to grant me an interview or to hire me is made based on the name and then the photo they see in my email. Because I not only represent a man in education, but I represent a man of color in education. And it's no surprise that my face is often the one they put on the marketing materials. And so
you're tokenized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And this has happened since forever. And it's something that I struggle with, as, I see that being a man grants me the privilege of being seen as smarter, more equipped to lead, more assertive. but I have this other identity that grants them the diversity card that allows them to say, oh, well, we have a second generation American on our faculty.
Sure.
We hired someone from a Muslim family,
Yeah.
and all of that. And,
Look at us, aren't we?
exactly.
Well.
Exactly. And I think that for a lot of people of color, men of color who are granted access to positions of power, like I have been very, very fortunate to have, excuse me, to gain access to positions of power, but I wonder at what cost.
Sure.
And it goes back to that original point of what am I willing to pay to play the game? What parts of myself am I willing to give up so that I can gain access to the institution, so that theoretically I could change them? But at what point will I be able to do that? And so how many banners am I willing to be put on when organizations are promoting hiring before
you bring in other men of color, other people of color, because they perceive that it's a safer space.
Exactly. No, it's windows and mirrors, right? You want to, when you're hiring, you want an organization to be able you want to be able to see yourself reflected in the organization, and you see people like me as windows through which you can see your own future.
Yeah.
But it's tough. It's always challenging and something to think about, especially for people of color, to think about what are you losing when you do that. And my brothers I've talked about this with my older brothers about this, because we've all been, very, very gratefully, very thankfully successful in our professional endeavors, but all of us have experienced tokenism to some degree, and we've all benefited from it. But we're all men.
Yeah.
And so we clear some of those initial screening questions that people have about whether or not we can do the job, and then we give them this great box that they can check.
Right.
Hire us.
Right.
But my brother said something a few years ago when I asked him about it, and he said that, well, you experience so much disadvantage. Why not take advantage of the benefits when they do come? If people are going to hire you out of some sense of white guilt, then why not?
Yeah.
Who are you benefiting by taking a stand not to take a job?
Right. Right. And then you lose you lose any opportunity to influence change.
Exactly.
When you're teaching specifically about healthy masculinity, I'm assuming that, this is something that is in your resume, is, they know this about you.
Yeah.
What do those conversations sound like, when you do sit in on an interview? And
yeah, I mean, if they ask me about it, it's often like, oh, you're so great. It's often like a sort of a praise.
Yeah.
But where people don't really want to get into the meat of it.
Uh-huh.
Because they assume that it's a part of my identity that is compartmentalized.
Sure.
As if it's not something that permeates every bit of work that I'm doing.
Yeah.
Where, in my current job, where I teach career skills to first-year students, I talk a lot about how our sense of professionalism is steeped in male supremacy and white supremacy. Yeah. That the whole word professionalism is a white supremacist word. It's oh, absolutely. The way we dress, the way we teach young men to dress, what do you say? A shirt and a tie.
Sure.
What about formal wear in other places? We say that your identity as a professional is based on your handshake, how strong your handshake is, whereas some communities, that is not something that they do at all.
I have funny, so my little old English grandfather, and I heard, it wasn't in this article, something else, I don't remember what it was, it talked about the owning class, and, of European immigrants who came over from Europe. My grandparents immigrated to the US from England, Great Britain. He was only 5'4", maybe, little tiny Englishman. He had these huge hands, and every male member of my family, he could put them on their knees. He called it his educated thumb, and his handshake, being able to stand my grandfather's handshake, and it's so he was a delightful, delightful little man. He was hilarious. But in his younger years, he was really feisty. He got in fights a lot.
Yeah.
And he, but for me, I have thought in the COVID, in the pandemic, I've thought about, well, I worked really hard to teach myself to shake hands.
Mm-hmm.
It was not, I wasn't included in that educated thumb thing with my grandfather. It was a man thing.
Yeah.
But it was to elevate myself as a professional and as someone who I'm comfortable in these spaces. I can, and now I'm like, well, now what are we going to do? Now now we don't get to, and it was important to me. I have a good handshake like that. I hate the noodle handshake. Yeah. And I'm like, this is a big part of my identity.
Yeah. Your strength as a professional is somehow tied to your physical grip.
Right.
Ridiculous, right? But it is something that we sort of, we place in our arsenal of professional skills.
Yeah.
Even if we don't think about it. We know that there's a perception of us based on that handshake, and we think about it. And yeah, so I think like to your earlier question about how, my work in masculinity permeates my other work, I talk about that. And I know that the first time I did, my manager was in the back of the room when I was leading this workshop on professionalism. And I started with that disclaimer.
Wow.
That we, in our program at my university, have a very specific definition of what professionalism is, but it's important to acknowledge that this is a sense of professionalism that some of you might have been raised in.
Yeah.
And for some of you, it might not be, indicative of your families, your experience of what professionalism is. If I walked into an interview for a teaching job wearing a sherwani, which is a traditional formal wear for an Indian wedding, they would look at me like I was bananas, right?
Right.
They would think I was crazy. They would remember me.
Yeah.
But I also know that that's the only thing they would remember. And I want my professional skills to stand on their own. And so it's a calculation I'm making.
So you conform to our version of professional. Yeah. I don't know if we talked about this last time, but I was at a professional event where two Olympians, did I talk about the Olympians? So two women Olympic soccer players had started a cosmetics line called Sweat Cosmetics. And they were here speaking to a group of young people. There were, soccer players from local area schools. And in the discussion, their moms now, in the discussion, they were talking about how much, somebody asked how much they make. And one of the women said, we don't take a paycheck because we are moms and we don't go to 9 to 5. They said, until we are devoting ourselves to this full time, we don't feel we deserve to be paid. And I was just crushed. And I didn't, it's like, okay, I had to make it, I couldn't make them look bad. They were, they were the guests. They had been, but I was just like, what do you do with that? Because it was bad enough that the young women, that the high school girl athletes in that room heard them say that. It was even worse that the boys did, because those boys are going to be the hirers, and those boys are going to be the bosses, and those boys are going to be the husbands. And, so this is something now I'm going to write about it.
Yeah.
But in the moment, I was like, damn, I didn't know what to do with it. But I knew that it was horrible that all those young people were hearing that. And I didn't know which was worse, that the girls heard it or that the boy. It's equally bad. It's
equally bad. It teaches us, I think, that it shows, and to go back to part of the article, it shows that it gives people, at least the men, a permission structure by which to continue to devalue women, even though we're hearing about, feminism and the Me Too movement over here. let me find something that will make it easier to continue to live the way I'm living over here.
Right.
I'm just going to ignore everything over there.
Right.
These people who are Olympians and they're powerful, so they must know what they're doing. And if they're talking about living in a way that preserves my power as a man, then why wouldn't I just adhere to that? Because it's easier.
Right.
It's simpler.
Yeah. Yeah. I was disappointed in myself in a way, but, without, I'm not great at talking off the cuff. Mm-hmm. I'm a writer because that's how I have learned to process the way that I feel about the world. I think that I grew up feeling like I was told what to think, that I was told what to say, that I was told how to be. So writing has very much become my way of figuring out what I think and what I believe and what I know from my lived experience to be true. Mm-hmm. And so much of that is informed by having been a single mom. And growing up, I think where I grew up with such a deeply segregated community, and Michigan being such a deeply mm-hmm. segregated state, and being such a heavily manufacturing state, to get back to like the fear aspect of it, and I know that what white men are afraid of is not being in charge.
Yep.
Afraid that if someone else is in charge, that someone else is going to treat them the way they've treated the someone else.
Yeah, that's an important point, and I don't think that's something that we think about often enough. That power, that's the power. Absolute power corrupts, but maybe it's just the people that are in power currently.
Yeah.
And that just because you're not in power doesn't mean that someone else is going to be in power in the same way that you were.
Right.
That there is more equitable forms of holding institutions and holding power.
Even what they're more afraid of than anything is accountability. Mm. This is a word that I think I've used a lot, probably. I'm kind of often asking men to hold other men accountable. And I guess how to approach that conversation in a healthy way, in a way that, allows it to be received, that, how, when you have come into institutions, as a man of color, talking about healthy masculinity, how do you break into those conversations when you're asking someone to risk,
I start with, what do you stand to gain and what do you stand to lose? And it's often about short-term and long-term costs and benefits. Mm-hmm. But it's really difficult. It has to be a decision that they make on their own. And I always encourage them that it starts with small things.
Yeah.
That, the transition from this sort of archaic, unhealthy form of masculinity transitioning into a healthy form of masculinity starts with small steps. There's this Mother Teresa quote that I often use, and the be faithful in small things, for it is in them that our strength lies. Mm. And so take small steps. And so I shared one last week where I started to say I love you to more members of my family. And I started with just my mom, who says it all the time to me. Yeah. And so I would just say it at the end of our phone calls. And then I started saying it to other people in my life. And then I would just start texting people like, hey, I was just thinking about you. I hope you're doing well. Love you. And that was, 10 years ago that I started doing that. And now I do it more often. And it starts with small things. Yeah. It starts with your inner circle, and then it will slowly move outward, and you'll become more comfortable calling people out if that's what you feel like you need to do in that moment. And so I try to approach it in a way that you're not going to be that, that guy who's calling all your buddies out right away. And you don't need to. It's okay to be the coal in that situation sometimes.
Sure.
To fall back. but ask yourself, what is it that you're losing in that situation? You're
Yeah.
allowing your friend to stand on his own when you know that you believe the same thing that he does. And so what are you going to do the next time you're in that situation?
Right.
Um,
It's about
because
personal integrity.
so personal integrity, and it's about knowing that you're going to lose sometimes. Like, you're going to mess up and you're going to make mistakes on your way on that journey towards healthier masculinity, but that's not reason to give up.
Right.
If you screw up, if you tell a joke that you've heard a million times and only that time when you're telling it, you realize the underlying misogyny that informs that joke,
You're like, oh, damn.
just don't tell it again.
Right.
It's okay. We're all going to make those mistakes, and there's a small portion of mistakes that we can't come back from.
Yeah.
And so the vast majority of the mistakes that we'll make on this journey towards healthier masculinity, you can redeem yourself. It's just about being a little bit better tomorrow.
Yeah.
It's about taking small steps.
That's one of the things, in dismantling racism is a big part of the work that I do, or a big part of my platform, I should say, because I don't work for money. Unfortunately, I'm trying. But so much of what I do is on a volunteer basis, is on just a community organizer basis, but one of the scariest parts of that is, when we have those conversations, we are going to make mistakes. Mm-hmm. We are, and that has to be okay. We have to be willing to make mistakes, but there is such, this perfectionism. We're supposed to know everything. We're supposed to have all the answers. We're supposed to be in control all the time. Anything about being vulnerable is like the furthest thing, anybody wants to do. But that's really a part of a lot of the work that I do. It's about being, I'm a huge fan of Brene Brown, for instance. Mm-hmm. That vulnerability thing, that to me, that's the only way that we can be better.
We just try.
Yeah, we just have to try. And I think when we go through life, life is fine for us for the most part. For me as a white woman. So to risk, when you were talking about your mom, and in certain cultures, you comply or you die. You comply or you have no food to eat. You comply or you have no roof over your head. For me, that's, I don't even know what I'm trying to say here. I think that we have to rely so much on the benevolence of men, and particularly the benevolence of white men. And what a crock.
Right. What a crock. Why? Why is it that way?
Right.
And I think that it's important, it's important to balance, the agency that living in a country like the United States does give marginalized populations, as relative to other countries. Mm-hmm. Right. And I'm speaking this as somebody who grew up in a middle class family. Mm-hmm. My parents moved here from India, but we were by no means wealthy. We were not upper middle class, but I never had to worry about where my next meal was coming from the way that my parents did growing up. Sure. But I also need to remember that doesn't mean that I need to, take advantage every single day of the power that I do have relative to my parents. Yeah. And recognize the struggles that I experience that are different from those that my parents experienced. And just, like I said before, take small steps forward. Keep a full perspective. Yeah. A part of the immigrant experience is, part of being a child of immigrants is trying to take advantage of every single opportunity that my parents didn't have. Right. And basically make sure that the decision they made to uproot their entire life for my benefit is not done in vain. Right. And I think that can be paralyzing feeling at times, when we do get access to positions of power and authority. But I think it's also really important, and this goes back to the entire conversation, is to be kind to ourselves. and understand that we may not have the same struggles that our parents did or that those who came before us did, but our struggles are unique to us. And so we should be mindful of the entire picture and move forward accordingly. And I think only then are we sort of not left paralyzed by constantly thinking through the potential consequences of any action that we take. And allows us to feel like it's okay to be wrong, and allows us to be a little bit more vulnerable when we're able to see the full picture.
Yeah. I think, so we have 10 minutes left. And I really, one of the, I want to do the article honor, and I want to do the, the 2 weeks, the whole, the whole conversation honor. One of the most striking things that I have been kind of coming to understand, and what I think was really clear from the article, was that it is the fear, men are afraid of each other. They grow up being bullied. They grow up, this whole don't be a pussy thing, because a pussy is the worst thing in the world anyone could be, or gay, that's the other worst thing in the world anyone could be. And this constant need to prove that you are not either of those things.
Yeah, so there's something that I've been thinking about a lot this week when you asked me about fear. And, my name is spelled A-L-I, which to a lot of Americans, a lot of people in the United States, they read as Ali. And so you can imagine that, like a lot of kids from other countries, other cultures, my name was hard to pronounce for my white teachers growing up. And I've heard every pronunciation of my name, like Ali, ally, just all different like tenses of the vowels. And the most fearful I was when I was called Ali. And it took me a long time to understand why. And it was because Ali is a girl's name. And I was more afraid than anything to be perceived as a girl. Growing up, that was the scariest thing, because I knew that the other kids in the class, both boys and girls, were going to be like, oh, that's such a girly name. And what worse insult could I possibly get than being told that a defining part of my identity, which is my name, is feminine, is not in line with the identities that I'm supposed to hold. And so what I would do, and I go by Ali now, and that's the pronunciation that I appreciate. It's not the original pronunciation of the name. My mom calls me Ali, which is sort of a neutral way of saying the vowels on either side of the L. But I professionally go by Ali. I like the way that sounds. But the reason that I started with it is because it's a name that's shared by one of the most famous boxers of all time. It's Ali, like Muhammad Ali, who is a sort of pinnacle of masculinity.
Absolutely.
Of toughness. He's a world champion boxer. Right? He fought for a living. He's known for being a good fighter. And so what better way to assert my masculinity than to invoke the name of one of the most masculine men in American history?
That'll do it.
That'll do it, right? And so it was the sort of overcorrection because I was afraid of being feminized. And I think how much I think about yes, my name should be pronounced the way I want it to be pronounced. And I'm not gonna let somebody mispronounce my name because that's part of my identity. But why I chose that pronunciation and why I was so afraid of that specific mispronunciation is just, it speaks to the performance that I was trying to give as a child, because I was so afraid of being feminized. There's nothing worse than being called a girl, that being associated with feminine characteristics, a feminine name, and just how I've, really difficult experiences thinking about back then, about, kids saying that my name is Ali and calling me Ali, and why that bothered me so much.
Well, and that's because society tells you that it should. That is because society, everything about the whole, we talked a little bit about the gender spectrum. But that's new information for a lot of people. That's not comfortable information for a lot of people, the fact that gender is a spectrum. So the gender binary really is kind of at the heart of all of it, because it's like, and not being able to define ourselves, it's those boxes. It's like, well, I need to, it's shorthand really, and it takes the place of building relationships and truly knowing people, doesn't it? Because it's like, well, I need to be able to know what box to put you in.
Yep.
For my brain to work, I need to know what gender you are. I need to know what your politics are these days, and I think that what Trump has done, and really what the clearest kind of historical reference I can make is Ronald Reagan and the welfare queens narrative. Because in my mind, like that wedge, Trump has been about making that clearly defined separation, reminding everyone of what that clearly, you guys made a mistake. You elected a Black president. So now we have to go all the way the other side, and we have to make sure you are reminded of what box you are supposed to belong in, and that you don't go over in that other box, at all. Because if you look at Barack Obama's election numbers, he won with, people who Trump won with,
right.
And that is just devastating that we fell for it.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is kind of a trope now, but the old, like, I have a Black friend became, I voted for Obama twice.
Right.
It was this badge of honor,
right.
Without realizing the actual ramifications that voting for a Black president would have for people of color's sense of agency in the United States. And I think when a lot of those Obama voters realize, well, oh wait, this isn't just a thing that I can say as a badge of honor. It's actually going to create some real institutional shifts in attitude towards power. Then, I don't know if I like that. Right. Although I was just tokenizing our presidency.
Right. I just liked that Black person, not all.
Exactly.
Yeah. I didn't mean that I wanted to like be in charge.
Yeah, it's that sort of like NIMBY racism. That sort of, you do that over there, but not in my backyard.
Right.
We'll elect you to a position that like kind of has ramifications for my life, but I'm pretty comfortable now. I think I'll be okay. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that I want to integrate my schools.
Right.
That doesn't mean that I want to have that affecting my own sense of power in my community.
Yeah. You mentioned schools, and you are an educator, so maybe that's a good place for us to kind of wrap on. We have Michigan, I've said this, is an extremely segregated state. We live in an extremely segregated community. White affluent schools on one side of the river, Black socioeconomically depressed schools who are at threat of being shut down on the other side of the river. And that, that river, I mean, there's some real metaphorical, lived out metaphor, in reality. I was listening to Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, Revisionist History, I believe it's called. And there's an episode called Miss Buchanan something. And he's talking about Brown v. the Board of Education, and how when that came down, the pressure was put on little children. That all of the weight of that decision was put on the shoulders of little children, and that the institutions themselves didn't, the teachers lost their jobs. When Black schools closed, Black teachers lost their jobs. Black teachers were not absorbed into the white schools because parents would say, no way was my kid going to learn from a Black teacher. The importance, the importance of where we go from here. You know, the reason that I'm doing this in this community and, you know, trying to help people understand the cost that our country has experienced with this president. I don't know.
Well, I think to your point about the schools, and I think that, I mean, this is, you know, commend you for what you're doing with this series, with all of your work, that just like the way that I think that the shift towards a healthier masculinity is only going to happen when men sign on and lead that movement. We're only ever going to dismantle racism when white people realize that it needs to happen.
Right.
And I think that the same thing occurs in our schools, that I'm 100% in support of increasing representation of teachers of color in the classroom. That's part of my old job. Minnesota has 4% teachers of color. Wow. And I was directing a teaching fellowship where I was trying to bring more students of color into the world of education. But I also know that white teachers can teach students of color in great ways. And it's going to be important that they do, so that they have role models that are that are white and that they can see themselves in. Because I think that institutional change is only ever going to happen when those who control the institutions decide it needs to happen, when they are willing to lead the charge that leads to their loosening of power.
Right.
And I think that in education, we need to do a better job of making that point made. You know, in education, there's a huge charge for representation. And I think that's so important. There's so few teachers of color across the country, but the teachers that we do have, primarily white women, we need to do a better job of training them on how to talk about race, on how to talk about masculinity. You know, it's really essential that they start to expand their understanding of what being a teacher is, to having those difficult conversations, so that in cases like Brown v. Board, where that all of that weight is placed on the student's shoulder, that weight needs to be distributed, and it needs to be put on the shoulders of the teachers who receive the appropriate training to have those conversations so that we can move forward.
Yeah, and on the administrators, on the, you know, from start to finish, we literally have one teacher of color, or black teacher in our school. He's a psychology teacher. And in Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, he talks about the importance of students of color having one black teacher in their entire school career, and what a difference that can make. And for me, I want my white boys to have him as a teacher. It is as important that my white boys have teachers of color as it is that children of color have teachers of color. Because I want my boys to experience the authority of people of color. Like, that's important to me.
And there's nothing that dismantles a stereotype than having a relationship with someone who contradicts all of them.
Yeah, which is exactly why we are paying with a Donald Trump presidency, because Barack Obama ruined that stereotype for so, you know, Well, it is 1:03, and I think that's kind of a perfect note to land on with, you know, triggered by Trumpism and all. And Ali, I'm so grateful to have had this conversation with you. I will forever call you a friend now. I hope that. Absolutely.
Likewise.
Good. I hope that we will have opportunities to meet in person and to do some work together in person, you know, when we're doing those things again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having this conversation with me and for doing everything that you're doing right now.
Oh, thank you for what you do. I, you know, as a mom and a wife and a daughter, and I want the men that I love to have fully human lives. I want them to experience all of the parts of themselves. And I want them to truly be able to be their authentic selves and to just soak everything up that life has to offer, you know?
Yeah. So, and it starts with the people around us allowing for that space, like you and like their teachers and other men in their lives. So appreciate what you're doing for not only us, but for the people that are in community with you.
Yeah, well, likewise. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you to Men4Choice. Thank you to Oren.
Yes.
Putting us together, and stay in the work, and we'll change the world together.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. This has been Open Studio with Kim Jorgensen Gane, episode whatever of my Trumpism series, wherein I ask the question, what have you started that's badass? Thank you all for joining me, and I hope to see you next week when RJ Williams, who is a Benton Harbor native, who went to school away from Benton Harbor and has returned home to tell the stories of her community. So join me then. Thank you so much. Bye.